In May 1845, two ships sailed from the harbor of Greenhithe on the Thames. They were not ordinary ships. They were the finest vessels of the British Royal Navy, strengthened and reinforced for a journey that no ship had ever completed. Their hulls were sheathed in iron, their bows were braced against the crushing pressure of ice. Their holds were filled with provisions for 3 years, tinned food, salted meat, thousands of gallons of lemon juice against scurvy, books, scientific instruments, even a small library. Their names were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, names that spoke of the darkness they were meant to penetrate, the terror they were meant to endure. They carried 129 men, a crew of officers and sailors, scientists and marines, men who had volunteered for the greatest adventure of their lives. Their commander was Sir John Franklin, a veteran of Arctic exploration, a man who had already survived 2 expeditions to the frozen north. He was 59 years old, an age when most men would have retired, but he had not given up his dream. He would find the Northwest Passage. He would sail from the Atlantic to the Pacific through the ice-choked labyrinth of the Canadian Arctic. He would write his name in the history of exploration. The ships passed down the Thames, past the docks and the warehouses, past the ships that carried trade to the ends of the empire. Crowds gathered on the banks to watch them go. They cheered, they waved, they wished the men good fortune. It was a moment of glory, of optimism, of faith in the power of British industry and British courage. The men on the ships waved back. They were young, most of them in their 20s and 30s, men who had signed on for adventure, for the chance to see the world, for the promise of a share in the glory. They did not know what they were sailing into. They could not have known. The Arctic was not a place that could be known from the maps in London, from the reports of previous expeditions, from the plans that had been laid in the Admiralty offices. The Arctic was a world apart, a world of ice and silence, of endless white that stretched to the horizon and beyond, of cold that could kill a man in minutes, of darkness that lasted for months. The men of Erebus and Terror would learn that world, would be consumed by it, would become part of its history, and they would never return. The expedition sailed north, past the coast of Greenland, into the waters that had defeated so many before them. They stopped in the Shetland Islands, in Greenland, in the Whalefish Islands, where they sent their last letters home. The letters were cheerful, confident, full of hope. "We are well," they wrote. "The ships are strong. The men are in good spirits. We will find the passage. We will return." They did not know that these letters would be the last words their families would ever hear from them. They did not know that the ships they sailed would become tombs, that the ice that surrounded them would hold them for 170 years, that their names would become a legend of horror, a warning, a mystery that would not be solved until the 21st century. In August 1845, Erebus and Terror were sighted by a whaling ship in Baffin Bay. The whalers reported that the expedition was in good order, that the men were healthy, that they were making good progress toward the entrance of the Northwest Passage. It was the last time the ships would be seen by anyone outside the expedition. They sailed into the ice, and they vanished. The Arctic does not give up its secrets easily. For more than a century, the fate of the Franklin expedition remained one of history's greatest mysteries. Search parties were sent, year after year, decade after decade. They found graves on Beechy Island, 3 men buried in the permafrost, their bodies preserved by the cold. They found abandoned ships, the skeletons of men scattered across the ice. They found letters, messages left in cairns, records of the expedition's final days. And they found the testimony of the Inuit, the people who had lived in the Arctic for thousands of years, who had seen the men of the expedition walking across the ice, their faces blackened, their minds broken, their bodies consumed by a horror that no one could name. The Inuit spoke of men who had died of starvation, of men who had been driven mad by the cold, of men who had turned to cannibalism, who had eaten the flesh of their comrades, who had become something that was no longer human. The stories were dismissed by the British investigators as savage superstition. the tales of a primitive people who could not understand the civilization that had come to their land. But the stories were true, and the evidence, when it was finally found, would confirm the darkest of the Inuit testimonies. The ice took the ships in September 1846. They were trapped in the Victoria Strait, northwest of King William Island, locked in a grip that would not release them for more than a year. The men waited. They had provisions for 3 years. They had warmth, shelter, the routine of shipboard life. They believed that the ice would break, that the spring would come, that they would sail on. But the spring did not come. The ice did not break. The ships were frozen in place, and the men were prisoners of the Arctic. The winter of 1846–1847 was long. The sun disappeared for months, leaving the ships in darkness, the men in a twilight that never lifted. The cold was beyond anything they had experienced. The temperature dropped to 40, 50, 60 degrees below zero. The metal of the ships contracted, the wood cracked, the ice pressed against the hulls with a pressure that could crush a lesser vessel. The men huddled in their cabins, burning coal, burning anything that would burn, trying to keep the cold at bay. They played cards, they read books, they wrote in their journals. They waited. The first deaths came in the winter. 3 men died on Beechy Island, buried in the permafrost before the expedition sailed on. Their bodies, exhumed in the 1980s, told a story that the expedition's records did not contain. They were young men in their 20s, strong and healthy when they sailed from England. But when their bodies were examined, the scientists found something that should not have been there. Their bones were laced with lead poisoning. The tinned food that was supposed to keep them alive was killing them. The solder that sealed the cans had leached into the food, contaminating it with a poison that would attack their minds, their bodies, their sanity. Lead poisoning causes nausea, fatigue, confusion, memory loss, paranoia. It causes the joints to ache, the muscles to weaken, the mind to slip into darkness. It causes a slow, creeping death, a death that takes the man apart piece by piece, leaving only the shell behind. The men of the Franklin expedition were being poisoned by the very technology that was supposed to save them. By the spring of 1847, the men were already suffering. The lead in their bones, in their blood, in their brains, was eating away at them. They did not know why they were sick. They did not know why their minds were clouded, why their bodies were failing, why the simplest tasks had become impossible. They only knew that something was wrong, that the Arctic was taking them, that the ice was not going to release them. Sir John Franklin died in June 1847. The cause of death was recorded in the expedition's records as apoplexy, a stroke, a sudden end to a life that had been devoted to the Arctic. He was buried in the ice, in the frozen ground of King William Island, where his body would lie for 170 years. His death was a blow to the expedition. He had been their leader, their symbol, their hope. Without him, the men were adrift, leaderless, lost in a white wilderness that had no end. The ice did not break in 1847. The ships remained frozen, the men remained trapped. The provisions were running low. The tinned food that was supposed to last 3 years was contaminated, inedible. The men were hungry, sick, desperate. They began to ration what was left, to stretch the supplies, to hope that the spring would come. But the spring did not come. The ice did not break. And in April 1848, the men made a decision that would seal their fate. They abandoned the ships. They packed what they could carry, food, tools, weapons, the records of the expedition, and they set out across the ice, heading south, toward the Canadian mainland, toward the trading posts that they hoped would save them. They were 105 men, all that remained of the 129 who had sailed from England. They were dragging boats on sledges, boats that weighed more than a ton, boats that were supposed to carry them down the rivers that would lead to safety. They were sick, exhausted, poisoned, starving, and they were walking into the heart of the Arctic. The route they took was a death march. The ice was treacherous, broken by pressure ridges that rose 20 feet high, cracked by leads of open water that could swallow a man in seconds. The cold was relentless, the wind a knife that cut through every layer of clothing. The men pulled their boats, stumbling, falling, getting up, falling again. They left behind them a trail of abandoned equipment, discarded food, the skeletons of men who could go no further. The Inuit who saw them described men whose faces were blackened, whose eyes were hollow, whose minds were gone. They did not speak. They did not respond to the Inuit who tried to help them. They walked and they fell and they died. The evidence of the death march was found by search parties in the years that followed. A boat, abandoned on the ice, containing 2 skeletons, the remains of men who had died where they sat. Clothing, tools, weapons scattered across the landscape. A record left in a cairn, written in the margins of a form that was meant for scientific observations. The record told the story of the expedition's last days. It described the death of Sir John Franklin, the abandonment of the ships, the decision to walk south. And it ended with a note that was written in a different hand, a hand that was shaking, that was barely legible. That was the hand of a man who knew he was going to die. The officers and men of the expedition are now on their way to the back river. They are in good health, they are in good spirits, they will reach safety. The note was a lie. The men were not in good health, they were not in good spirits. They were dying one, by the dozens, by the hundreds. And the evidence of their deaths, when it was found, would reveal a horror that the British investigators could not accept. The bones were found on King William Island, scattered across the landscape, the remains of men who had died where they fell. The scientists who examined them in the 20th century found the same lead contamination that had been found in the graves on Beechy Island. They found cut marks on the bones, marks that could only have been made by a knife, marks that were consistent with the removal of flesh from the bone. The men of the Franklin expedition had turned to cannibalism. They had eaten the flesh of their comrades, had cut the meat from the bones, had consumed the bodies of the dead to keep themselves alive. It was the darkest of the Inuit testimonies, the testimony that the British investigators had dismissed as savage superstition. But it was true. The men had been driven to it by hunger, by desperation, by the slow poison that was eating away their minds. They had become something that was no longer human. They had become the thing that the Inuit had described, the thing that walked across the ice with blackened faces and hollow eyes, the thing that ate the flesh of the dead. The last of the men died in the spring of 1849. No one knows exactly where or when or how. No one knows who was the last, who survived the longest, who looked out across the white wilderness and saw no hope, no rescue, no way back. The Arctic took them all. The ice swallowed them, the cold consumed them, the silence covered them. And for more than a century their fate remained a mystery, a story that was told in fragments, in bones, in Inuit testimony, in the records that were found in the cairns. The ships that had carried them, Erebus and Terror, were lost. They lay at the bottom of the Victoria Strait, frozen in the ice, buried in the darkness, waiting to be found. They were found in the 21st century. In 2014, the wreck of HMS Erebus was discovered in the waters of the Victoria Strait, remarkably preserved by the cold, the ice, the darkness. In 2016, HMS Terror was found, even more intact, its hatches sealed, its cabins intact, its library still on the shelves. The ships were time capsules, frozen in the moment when the men abandoned them, preserved by the Arctic that had taken them. They held the secrets of the expedition, the evidence of what had happened in the final days, the answers to the questions that had haunted historians for generations. The ships told a story of order, of discipline, of men who had tried to maintain the routines of the Royal Navy even as they were dying. The cabins were tidy, the equipment was stored, the records were kept. But they also told a story of desperation, of men who had tried to escape, who had packed their boats with everything they could carry, who had walked out into the ice knowing that they would not return. The ships were the last evidence of the men who had sailed from England in 1845, who had been full of hope, who had believed that they would find the Northwest Passage, who had believed that they would return in glory. They did not return. They became part of the Arctic, absorbed by the ice, buried in the silence. The tragedy of the Franklin expedition is not just a story of failure. It is a story of the Arctic itself, of a place that does not forgive, that does not yield, that does not care about the ambitions of men. The Arctic is a world apart, a world of ice and silence, of unending white that stretches to the horizon and beyond. It is a place where the sun disappears for months, where the cold can kill a man in minutes, where the ice can crush the strongest ship. The men who went there thought they could conquer it. They thought they could bend it to their will, that they could find a passage through its frozen heart, that they could return with the knowledge that would open the Arctic to the world. They were wrong. The Arctic conquered them. It took them, it held them, it did not let them go. And it kept their secret for 170 years. The Arctic Gothic is a genre of the imagination, a way of seeing the frozen north as a place of horror, of madness, of the sublime. It is the landscape of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, of Edgar Allan Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, of H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. It is a landscape of unending white, of silence that presses on the ears, of cold that seeps into the bones. It is a landscape that strips away civilization, that reduces men to their most basic instincts, that reveals the darkness that lies beneath the surface of the human mind. The Franklin expedition lived in that landscape. They experienced the Arctic Gothic not as a literary genre, but as a reality. They saw the sun disappear for months. They heard the ice groan and shift beneath them. They felt the cold that could freeze the blood in their veins. They walked across the white landscape, dragging their boats, their minds clouded by lead, their bodies failing, their hopes dying. They became the Arctic Gothic. They became the story that we tell, the legend that we remember, the warning that we carry. The evidence of the expedition is still there, in the bones that lie scattered on King William Island, in the ships that rest at the bottom of the Victoria Strait, in the permafrost that holds the bodies of the 3 men buried on Beechey Island. The scientists who have studied the remains have learned much. They have learned about the lead poisoning that weakened the men, about the scurvy that made their gums bleed and their wounds refuse to heal, about the cold that killed them. They have learned about the cannibalism that the men resorted to in their final days, the cut marks on the bones that tell a story of desperation, of hunger, of the loss of the last vestiges of humanity. But there is much that they do not know. They do not know who was the last to die. They do not know what the final moments were like, what the men saw, what they thought, what they felt. They do not know if there was a moment when the silence was broken, when someone screamed, when someone called out for help that would never come. They do not know if the men died in despair, or in hope, or in the numbness that comes when the cold has taken everything else. The Inuit knew. The Inuit had always known. They had watched the men walk across the ice, had seen their faces blackened, their eyes hollow, their minds gone. They had tried to help them, to give them food, to lead them to safety. The men had not responded. They had walked on into the white, into the silence, into the darkness. The Inuit had found their bodies, scattered across the landscape, their bones gnawed, their flesh consumed. They had told the story to the search parties who came from England, who asked questions, who wrote down the answers in their notebooks. The British investigators had dismissed the story as savage superstition. They could not believe that Englishmen, that the officers and men of the Royal Navy, would descend to cannibalism. They could not believe that the expedition that had sailed with such hope, with such confidence, with such faith in the power of British civilization, had ended in such horror. But it was true. The Inuit had told the truth. And the truth was that the Arctic had taken the men of the Franklin expedition, had broken them, had stripped them of everything that made them human, had left them to die in the white silence. The Franklin expedition is a story about the limits of human ambition. It is a story about a time when the world was still being mapped, when there were places that no European had ever seen, when the imagination was filled with dreams of the unknown. The men who sailed on Erebus and Terror, believed that they were part of something greater than themselves, that they were pushing the boundaries of knowledge, that they were writing their names in the history of exploration. They did not know that they were walking into a trap, that the Arctic would take them, that they would become the history, not as explorers but as victims. They did not know that their names would be remembered not for what they achieved, but for what they suffered. The Northwest Passage was found, eventually, by explorers who followed in the wake of the Franklin expedition. They found the route that the men of Erebus and Terror had sought, the passage through the ice that connected the Atlantic to the Pacific. They did not find it by sailing through it. They found it by mapping the Arctic from the land, by learning from the Inuit, by understanding the ice and the currents and the cold. They found it by respecting the Arctic, not by trying to conquer it. And they found it with the help of the evidence that the Franklin expedition had left behind, the bones, the ships, the records that told them where the ice would be, where the currents would take them, where the danger lay. The ships that carried the Franklin expedition are still there, at the bottom of the Victoria Strait, preserved by the cold, the ice, the darkness. They are a memorial to the men who sailed on them, to the 129 who left England in 1845 and never returned. They are a reminder of the cost of ambition, of the price that is paid when men try to bend the world to their will. They are a warning, a story that we tell to remind ourselves that there are places where we do not belong, that there are forces that we cannot control, that there are silences that will not be broken. The Arctic Gothic is not just a story about the past. It is a story about the present, about the ways that we still try to conquer the world, to map it, to control it, to make it serve our purposes. The Arctic is changing. The ice is melting. The passage that the Franklin expedition sought is opening, year by year, becoming a route for ships that carry goods from one ocean to another. The world is warming, the ice is retreating, and the Arctic that killed the men of Erebus and Terror is becoming a place that can be navigated, exploited, used. But the Arctic is still there, the silence is still there, the cold is still there, and the warning that the Franklin expedition left behind is still there. Do not underestimate the Arctic. Do not think that you can conquer it. It will take you as it took them, and it will hold you as it held them, and it will not let you go. The men of the Franklin expedition are gone. Their ships are at the bottom of the sea. Their bones are scattered across the ice. Their names are recorded in the history books, a footnote, a cautionary tale, a story that we tell to remind ourselves of the limits of human ambition. But the Arctic is still there. The ice is still there. The silence is still there. And if you listen, if you stand on the shores of King William Island, if you look out across the white wilderness that stretches to the horizon, you can still hear them. You can hear the men who walked across the ice, dragging their boats, their minds clouded by lead, their bodies failing, their hopes dying. You can hear the creak of the ships, the groan of the ice, the wind that howls across the frozen sea. You can hear the silence that swallowed them, the silence that holds them still, the silence that will always be there, waiting for the next expedition, the next ambition, the next men who think they can conquer the Arctic. The Franklin expedition is a story about the Arctic, but it is also a story about us. It is a story about what happens when we push too far, when we think that we are stronger than the world, when we forget that we are small, fragile, temporary. It is a story about the darkness that lies within us, the darkness that the cold can bring to the surface, the darkness that the silence can make real. It is a story about the white landscape that strips away everything that is not essential, that leaves only the bare bones of existence, that reveals the truth that we spend our lives trying to hide, that we are mortal, that we will die, that the world will go on without us, that the ice will cover us, that the silence will hold us. The men of Erebus and Terror were not the first to die in the Arctic. They were not the last. They were among the many who have been taken by the white silence, who have become part of the landscape, who have been absorbed by the ice. Their story is not unique. It is a story that has been told before, that will be told again, that will be told as long as men look at the map and see the white spaces. The the places that have not been conquered, the places that call to them with a voice that is older than language, that is deeper than reason, that is the voice of the unknown. The Arctic calls, it always calls, and sometimes it takes. The silence of the Arctic is not empty. It is filled with the voices of those who have been taken, with the stories that they left behind, with the warnings that they carved into the ice. The men of the Franklin expedition left their warning in the bones, in the ships, in the records that were found in the cairns. They left it in the testimony of the Inuit, who saw them walk across the ice, who saw their faces blackened, their eyes hollow, their minds gone. They left it in the lead that poisoned them, in the cut marks on the bones, in the cannibalism that was the final descent into darkness. They left it in the ships that lay at the bottom of the Victoria Strait for 170 years, waiting to be found, waiting to tell their story. And now that the ships have been found, now that the story has been told, now that the silence has been broken, what do we do with what we have learned? Do we remember the men of the Franklin expedition as heroes, as victims, as warnings? Do we see in their story the reflection of our own ambitions, our own desires, our own blindness? Do we hear in the silence of the Arctic the voice that calls to us, that tells us that there are places we should not go, that there are forces we should not challenge, that there are limits we should not exceed? The Arctic does not answer these questions. The Arctic does not answer any questions. It only exists in its silence, in its cold, in its white expanse that stretches to the horizon and beyond. It only waits, as it has always waited, for the next expedition, the next ambition, the next men who think they can conquer it. And when they come, when they sail into the ice, when they disappear into the white silence, the Arctic will take them as it took the men of the Franklin expedition, and it will hold them as it held them, and it will not let them go. The Franklin expedition is over. The ships are found, the bones are collected, the story is told, but the Arctic is still there. The silence is still there, and the warning is still there, written in the ice, carved into the bones, whispered by the wind. Do not go, do not try. Do not think that you are stronger than the world. The world is stronger. The world will take you, and the world will not give you back. In the end, the Franklin expedition is not a story about the Northwest Passage. It is not a story about exploration or ambition or the glory of the Royal Navy. It is a story about the Arctic, about the place that took 129 men and never let them go. It is a story about the silence that covers the white landscape, the silence that the men of Erebus and Terror walked into, the silence that swallowed them, the silence that holds them still. It is a story about the cold that killed them, the cold that preserved them, the cold that made them part of the landscape, that made them the Arctic. And it is a story about us, about the darkness that we carry, about the ambition that drives us, about the limits that we will not acknowledge until we have passed them, until it is too late, until the ice has closed over us, until the silence has taken us. The men of the Franklin expedition sailed from England in 1845. They were full of hope. They were confident. They believed that they would find the Northwest Passage, that they would return in glory, that they would write their names in the history of exploration. They did not return. They did not find the passage. They did not write their names in the history of exploration. They wrote their names in the history of horror, in the story of the Arctic, in the silence that covers the white landscape. They became the Arctic Gothic. They became the legend. They became the warning. And the warning is still there, in the ships that lie at the bottom of the Victoria Strait, in the bones that are scattered across King William Island, in the permafrost that holds the bodies of the 3 men buried on Beechy Island. The warning is still there in the testimony of the Inuit, who saw the men walk across the ice, who saw their faces blackened, their eyes hollow, their minds gone. The warning is still there, in the lead that poisoned them, in the cut marks on the bones, in the cannibalism that was the final descent into darkness. The warning is still there, in the silence that covers the Arctic, the silence that has always been there, the silence that will always be there, waiting for the next men who think they can conquer it. The Franklin expedition is a story about the Arctic, but it is also a story about us. It is a story about what happens when we forget that we are small, that we are fragile, that we are temporary. It is a story about what happens when we think that we are stronger than the world. The world is stronger. The Arctic is stronger. The silence is stronger. And the men of the Franklin expedition learned that lesson in the ice, in the cold, in the darkness. They learned it and they died and they became the Arctic and they became the warning. And the warning is still there, for us, for our time, for our ambitions, for our dreams of conquering the world. The Arctic is waiting, the silence is waiting, and the ice is always there.